The war room on the 40th floor of Vance Maritime had not been quiet in 11 hours. Richard Vance stood at the head of the table with a single printed document in his hand. 18 pages, no letterhead, no name on the cover, and for the first time since the crisis began, the numbers on the screen behind him were finally moving in the right direction. He looked up at the room full of vice presidents, who had spent the last week telling him this problem could not be solved in under a month. "Who made this plan?" he asked. Nobody answered right away. Then someone did. "The single dad you suspended, sir." Richard Vance did not move for a long moment. Then he asked them to get the man on the phone. Immediately. 6 weeks earlier, Ethan Cole had been the kind of employee most companies didn't know they needed until the day they desperately did. He worked on the 9th floor of Vance Maritime's operations division, a senior logistics analyst with a cubicle, instead of an office, and a job title that undersold what he actually did by a wide margin. He'd been there 4 years, ever since he'd left a much larger firm to build a schedule flexible enough to pick his son up from school. 3 days a week, the 2 days his ex-wife's work, travel made impossible. His son, Sam, was 7. Ethan had learned, in the 2 years since the divorce, exactly how much of a life could be rebuilt around a single non-negotiable fact. He needed to be home by 4:15 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and he had built every other part of his professional life to bend around that fact, rather than the other way around. It meant turning down 2 promotions. It meant a smaller title than his work justified. It meant very little recognition, and Ethan had made peace with that trade a long time ago. Because the version of himself that picked Sam up from school on time was worth more to him than the version that sat in a corner office. What Ethan hadn't made peace with, not entirely, was watching his ideas disappear into other people's names. His direct supervisor was a regional operations director named Carol Danvers, sharp, ambitious, and skilled in the particular art of appearing indispensable to people above her while making the people below her feel replaceable. She had run the division for 6 years and had built her reputation, in no small part, on ideas that had not originated with her. Ethan had noticed the pattern in his 2nd year and adjusted his expectations accordingly. He kept doing the work. He simply stopped expecting his name to travel with it. In late autumn, Ethan noticed something in the shipping data that nobody else on the floor seemed to be tracking. A labor dispute was quietly building at the port of Halden, the single largest entry point for nearly 40% of Vance Maritime's incoming freight. Union negotiations had stalled twice in 3 months. Ethan had spent years learning to read the difference between ordinary friction and the kind that ended in a strike, and this had the second kind of shape. He built a contingency plan on his own time, without being asked, the way he'd built a dozen unglamorous fixes before that nobody had specifically requested. It rerouted 40% of incoming freight through 2 secondary ports, restructured delivery contracts to absorb a temporary capacity loss, and laid out week by week exactly how the company could survive a strike lasting up to 6 weeks without a catastrophic loss in fulfillment. It took him 11 consecutive late nights to finish, most of them after Sam had gone to bed. He brought it to Carol on a Wednesday morning, 18 pages. Clean formatting, no unnecessary flourish. She read the first 3 pages standing at her desk, set it down, and told him that Holden's negotiations were not the operations division's concern, and that speculative planning of this scope required executive sign-off she had no interest in requesting over what was, in her words, a labor dispute that happens every contract cycle. Ethan said he thought this one was different. Carol said she'd take it under advisement, which was a phrase Ethan had learned over 4 years. Meant the opposite of what it claimed to mean. He didn't argue. He'd learned that arguing rarely changed outcomes and often changed how people remembered you afterward, and he had a 7-year-old at home who needed him more than he needed to win a disagreement with Carol Danvers. He saved the plan to the shared operations drive, filed under a project code nobody but him had reason to open, and went back to the work in front of him. 3 weeks later, the Port of Halden's dock workers walked off the job. The strike hit on a Monday, and by Wednesday, Vance Maritime's 9th floor was in a version of chaos that Ethan had specifically designed his plan to prevent. Freight was backing up at Halden with nowhere to go. Delivery contracts across the eastern seaboard were beginning to breach their own terms. Carol Danvers, 3 days into the crisis, had spent most of it in closed-door calls with the executive floor, and the operations team beneath her was improvising with no coordinated plan at all. On Thursday morning, Ethan mentioned carefully, in a floor meeting, not trying to score a point, simply trying to be useful, that he'd built a rerouting plan back in October that addressed almost exactly this scenario, and that it was still sitting on the shared drive if anyone wanted to look at it. Carol's expression didn't change, but something in the room did. 2 directors exchanged a glance. Carol said she'd review it that afternoon. She did not review it that afternoon. What happened instead, less than 3 hours later, was that Ethan was called into a small conference room by an HR coordinator he didn't recognize and told that a formal complaint had been filed against him in insubordination, specifically tied to a pattern of what the complaint described as unauthorized escalation of concerns outside proper channels. Over the preceding several weeks, Ethan asked what channels he was accused of going around. The coordinator said the complaint cited multiple instances, including a floor meeting that morning, and that pending a formal review, he was being placed on unpaid administrative suspension, effective immediately. He asked whose complaint it was. The coordinator, reading from a form, said the complaint had been filed by his direct supervisor. Ethan sat with that for a moment. He thought about Sam, about Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4:15, about 11 late nights spent building something nobody had asked him for. He did not raise his voice. He asked if he could collect his things. He walked out of Vance Maritime's 9th floor at 2:40 that afternoon with a small box under one arm. And by the time he reached his car in the employee lot, he had already decided he would not call anyone to argue his case. Some fights, he had learned, were not won by fighting them. They were won by being right later, quietly, in a way nobody could take credit for twisting. He picked Sam up from school at 4:12 that day, 3 minutes early, for once. By the following Monday, the strike at Halden was in its 2nd week, and Vance Maritime's freight backlog had grown to a size that could no longer be described in the language executives preferred, which was the language of temporary disruption. Richard Vance, the company's founder and chairman, had built Vance Maritime over 31 years from a single leased freighter into one of the largest privately held logistics operations on the eastern seaboard. He did not often involve himself directly in operations-level crises. That was what he paid a leadership structure to handle, but 11 days into a disruption with no resolution in sight and mounting daily losses in the 7 figures, he walked into the war room on the 40th floor and asked, plainly, why nobody in this building had seen this coming. Carol Danvers, in that meeting, described the strike as an unforeseeable labor event. It was, in fact, the exact scenario Ethan Cole had described in writing 5 weeks earlier. Richard asked whether anyone had modeled a rerouting contingency. Several directors looked at each other, one of them a younger operations manager named Priya Shah, who had worked 2 cubicles down from Ethan, and had quietly respected his work for longer than she'd said out loud, mentioned carefully that she believed something like that might exist on the shared drive. She found it in under 10 minutes. 18 pages. Clean formatting, filed under a project code she recognized as Ethan's. She brought it to the war room without asking Carol first, because by that point, 11 days into a crisis costing the company millions a day, she had decided that whose name was on a plan mattered considerably less than whether the plan worked. The executive team implemented the rerouting framework within 18 hours, adapting Ethan's original numbers to the current scale of the backlog. It was not a perfect fit 6 weeks old, built on projections rather than the strike's actual shape, but the underlying architecture held, and within 4 days, freight movement through the 2 secondary ports began climbing back towards something resembling stability. By the end of the 1st week, the daily loss figures had been cut by more than half. Richard Vance had reviewed the plan's origin file exactly once, in passing in the chaos of implementation, and had not thought to ask who Ethan Cole actually was. It was 11 days into the strike, in a war room meeting, reviewing the 3rd consecutive day of improving numbers, that he finally held up the original document, the 18 pages, still unattributed on its cover page, and asked the room the only question that had not yet been answered: who made this plan? The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when a question has an answer that several people in it already know, and would rather not be the one to say out loud. Priya Shah was the one who finally spoke. "The single dad you suspended, sir," she said. "Ethan Cole, operations analyst, 9th floor. He built it in October." Carol filed a complaint against him the same week it would have mattered most. Richard Vance set the document down on the table. He did not raise his voice, and he did not ask a follow-up question immediately. He simply looked at Carol Danvers, seated 4 chairs down, for long enough that the silence itself became the question. Carol said that the complaint had been about pattern of conduct, not about the plan itself. Richard asked her to define specifically what unauthorized channel a floor meeting represented. Carol did not have an answer that survived being said out loud in that room. Richard asked Priya to get Ethan Cole on the phone immediately. Ethan was in his kitchen, helping Sam with a school project involving a shoebox and a considerable amount of glue, when his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He was 2 weeks into unpaid suspension with no update from HR, had begun quietly applying to other roles, and had decided, somewhere in the 2nd week, that Vance Maritime was probably not going to call him back with anything he wanted to hear. He answered, anyway. Richard Vance introduced himself, and for a moment, Ethan didn't say anything at all, because in 4 years at the company he had never once spoken to the chairman directly. Richard didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told Ethan that his rerouting plan had been implemented 11 days into the Holden strike, that it had cut the company's daily losses by more than half, and that he wanted to know, directly from Ethan, why a plan of that quality had been sitting unused on a shared drive for 5 weeks, while the company burned through millions of dollars a day. Ethan, glue drying on his fingers, told him the truth. He'd built it because he saw the strike coming. He'd brought it to his supervisor in October. He'd been told it wasn't the operations division's concern. Richard asked about the suspension. Ethan said he'd mentioned the plan again in a floor meeting the week. The strike began and had been suspended for insubordination 3 hours later. There was a pause on the line long enough that Ethan almost asked if the call had dropped. Then Richard said that he would like Ethan back in the building the following morning, that the suspension was being reversed effective immediately with full back pay, and that he had some questions he wanted to ask him in person about how a company builds contingency plans it actually listens to. Ethan thanked him. Sam, sitting across the table with a shoebox rocket half assembled in front of him, asked who was on the phone. "Simone from my old job," Ethan said. "I think I might be going back." Ethan returned to Vance Maritime the next morning, not to his cubicle on the 9th floor, but to the 40th, where Richard Vance met him in a small conference room with a cup of coffee already poured and waiting. Richard didn't open with an apology. Not exactly. He opened by asking Ethan to walk him through the entire plan from scratch, not the summary. The reasoning underneath every number, and Ethan did, for the better part of an hour, answering questions with the same quiet directness that had gotten him suspended 3 weeks earlier. When it was over, Richard told him 2 things. The first was that he was being offered a newly created position, director of contingency planning, reporting directly to operations leadership, rather than through Carol Danvers, with a mandate to build exactly the kind of forward-looking risk models the company had apparently been ignoring for years. The second was that Carol Danvers's complaint, along with the broader pattern of how ideas move through her division, was now under a formal review that Richard intended to see through completely, regardless of what it found. Ethan asked what would happen to Carol. Richard said that depended on what the review found, and that he wasn't going to prejudge it in front of the person it had wronged, because that wasn't how he wanted this company to operate going forward. Ethan appreciated that more than he expected to. He didn't ask for anything beyond his role and his back pay. He didn't ask for Carol to be punished. And when the review eventually concluded 3 weeks later, finding a documented pattern of credit reallocation stretching back nearly 2 years, along with the improperly filed complaint against Ethan, he heard about her resignation the same way everyone else did, through a company-wide email, and felt less satisfaction in it than he expected to. What he felt instead, mostly, was relief that Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4:15 were still his to keep. 6 months later, Ethan sat in his new office on the 40th floor, smaller than most of the offices around it, because he'd specifically asked for one close to the elevator so he could still make it to Sam's school on time, twice a week reviewing a contingency framework for a different port, a different risk, built the same way he built everything, quietly, thoroughly, without waiting to be asked. Sam visited the office once that spring during a school break and asked his father what exactly he did all day. Ethan thought about it for a moment. "I try to see problems before they happen," he said, "so that when they do happen, nobody has to panic." Sam considered this with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old weighing a new idea. "Did anybody listen to you before?" he asked. "Not for a long time," Ethan said, but the plan was still right. It just had to wait for the right moment to matter. He didn't tell Sam the rest of it, that being right had cost him 3 weeks of unpaid suspension, and almost cost him a great deal more, or that the difference between being ignored and being heard had come down to 11 days of a crisis nobody wanted, and one honest answer in a room he wasn't even in. What he wanted Sam to understand, in the version a 7-year-old could actually hold on to, was simpler than any of that. That doing the work quietly and doing it right was never wasted, even in the stretch of time before anyone else could see it. The rest, Ethan thought, Sam would learn eventually the way most people did, slowly, and usually the hard way. For now, it was enough that they'd made it home by 4:15.